I think one genuine idea is, could you persuade Jeremy Clarkson to make season 3 of Clarkson's Farm a new cash crop? Because he does actually, by showing people how mad the planning system is.
The impact of red tape costs could be as high as 3 to 4% of GDP.
The alien anthropologists would say the British government's role in tech is to bully American technology companies.
Everything I think we see is about the kind of dystopia that we're heading towards and the ills of technology. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last Institute of Economic Affairs panel of this Conservative Party conference. My name's Tom Clougherty. I'm the Executive Director of the IEA, and for the next hour, I'll be chairing our discussion of Going for Growth, the Abundance Agenda. It's an interesting, hopefully exciting topic, one that is dear to our hearts at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and hopefully in this room as well. I think we all perhaps feared when the Truss government crashed and burned so spectacularly that talking about economic growth and the policies that might bring it about would be off the agenda for a while. So I was pleasantly surprised by the Labour Party's embrace of pro-growth rhetoric and supposed supply-side reform. Now, of course, the proof will be in the pudding, but I think there are already signs that may be quite a lot of hot air, and that, in fact, the same old top-down approaches will fail now as they have failed in the past, and that the left is, as always, more concerned with distributing the pie than with growing it. The question, of course, is whether the Conservative Party is any different, whether they've been different in the past, whether, indeed, they will be different in the future. So to discuss these issues and more, I think we have a wonderful panel for you today. Starting at my left, we have Victoria Hewson, a former member of the IEA's International Trade and Competition Unit. She worked as a SPAD in the Northern Ireland Office, the Foreign Office, and most recently with Kemi Badenoch in the Department of Business and Trade. She's also a qualified solicitor and hoping to get back to contributing to the private sector economy, I believe. Immediately to my left, we have Matthew Feeney, Head of Technology and Innovation at the Centre for Policy Studies. Matthew's an expert on all things tech policy. He previously worked at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. and for Reason Magazine. Both places, in fact, all three of our jobs, we had those jobs, we had to each other, which is interesting. To my right, Fiona Cuthbertson, Director of Keystone Consulting, a public affairs agency that helps businesses understand politics. Fiona is also a podcaster and indeed a published novelist. But first, we have Sam Dumitriu, Head of Policy at Britain Remade, where he's made a number of splashes with his research on planning, infrastructure and energy policy. He's former Director or Head of Research at the Entrepreneurs Network and at the Adam Smith Institute. So, Sam, over to you to kick us off.
So is there a better antidote to the idea of degrowth in the last 15 years? Now, look, it's really refreshing to see that a Labour government has at least said that they're going to do stuff on economic growth, that they think it's a good thing and they want to pursue it. But it's crucial that they don't just have the correct goals, but also the correct means for getting to those goals. Now, the government is currently racing to produce an industrial strategy. The fact that they're racing to produce one suggests it's not going to be a particularly good one. But Britain's economic problem isn't that we have failed to pick and subsidise winners. Our problem is that our broken planning system turns our winners, turns countless winning propositions into losers. Britain doesn't need to jettison markets for an active industrial policy. It needs to get the basics right. You may have read the excellent Foundations essay by Ben Southwood, Sam Bowman and Samuel Hughes. And one of the most interesting questions it asks is, why are the French more productive than the Brits? France, after all, is a country where they are so overregulated that it is the Waterstones 2 for 3 for 2 discount is illegal. They are so overregulated and they have such bad labour relations that trade unionists have developed special barbecues that fit in tram tracks, so as they march, they can grill sausages. You know, I mean, that is a sign of productivity in a way, right, if you're doing that on a march. But, you know, I read an article in the New York Times once where it talked about how every driving school in France had to own a DVD player for video instructions, even though most people don't own DVD players anymore and they're not necessary at all. But the difference is that while France gets a lot of stuff wrong, and actually I think Britain gets a lot of hard stuff right. We have very, very good universities. If you look at some of the post-Brexit reforms in things like gene-edited crops, we get some of the hard stuff really right, much righter than France. The problem is France gets the foundations, the fundamentals right. They have a massive fleet of nuclear power stations, while our cost of industrial electricity has tripled since 2005. They were able to survive the Russian gas crisis because they had lots of nuclear power stations. They have 7 million more homes per person, despite having a similarly sized population. In the last 25 years, they have built more motorway, most of it, I might add, privately financed, than Britain has ever built. Yet in Britain, everywhere you look, through regulation and planning, we effectively ban investment. We ban productivity. We ban investment in new sources of clean energy, whether it's nuclear, renewables, the pylons to take all of that power and actually put it in our homes. We ban new homes in our most productive places. It's very, very, very difficult to build homes in the most overheated housing markets. We make it almost impossible to build new roads, railways, trams, you name it, we make it difficult to build. We ban film studios next to other massive film studios next to one of our main airport. We ban the building of data centres, despite the fact we know that the future is AI, and you might need some of those data centres for that. Now, let me give you some examples. So Britain Remade over the past 2 years now has been drawing attention to the madness of Britain's planning system. So I'll give you a few examples. The Lower Thames Crossing, which, by the way, I'm told we are going to get a decision on this week. So it's a road tunnel proposed between Kent and Essex. The idea is the Dartford crossing is extremely congested, and it would be a good idea to have another road to alleviate that congestion, given that it connects some of our busiest ports in the country. So we analysed their planning application. This is what we discovered. It was 358,000 pages long. Genuinely, I'm not making this up. And I can show you I'm not making this, because we also went to them and we said, hello, National Highways, you're a public body, let's do a freedom of information request. How much have you spent on this planning application? And they told us they'd spent £297 million. Think about this, right? So, Norway, now, Norwegian tunnelling is different than British tunnelling. It's easier to tunnel through hard rock because you don't have to worry about things falling in. There's lots of reasons why Norwegian tunnelling might be cheaper. But Norway built the world's longest road tunnel for half what it cost one arm of the British state to ask another arm of the British state to build a road tunnel. Clearly, something is massively wrong. Now, Britain used to lead the world in nuclear power. We split the atom. We built the world's first full-scale commercial nuclear power station in Cumbria. As late as 1965, Britain had more nuclear reactors than any other country in the world combined. Yet we haven't built a new one in almost 29 years now. The one we are building, Hinkley Point C, is set to cost 6 times more on a megawatt for megawatt basis what it costs Korea to build their nuclear power stations on average. Hinkley Point C's environmental impact assessment, 30,000 pages long. Sizewell C, which is the latest nuclear power station to go through the planning system, was 44,000 pages. Now, the Hinkley Point C design is the same one, roughly, being used in Flamanville in France. However, to comply with UK regulation, our Office for Nuclear Regulation insisted on 7,000 changes to the design. For instance, Flamanville has a digital control room. Our one has a digital control room and an analog control room as a backup. It's very, very silly, by the way, to have such a high insistence on safety on the British one, because actually the British nuclear reactor is not as near to most Brits as the French nuclear reactor, because obviously because most people live in the southeast and the French is on the western coast. So, already a bit silly. But so EDF have been forced to spend millions upon millions of pounds protecting a very small number of fish. So I don't know how many people here know how a nuclear power station works, but essentially you need to cool it down. So you have this water pipe intake. Sometimes fish swim through that intake. Because it gets very hot in a nuclear reaction, those fish end up poached. Now, it's a good thing, all things being equal, to protect as many fish as we can. However, there's trade-offs. Now, and we do things that probably will only save a few fish that add massive millions of pounds to cost. So an example, buy that intake pipe, which, by the way, is which is the most fish-friendly intake pipe in the world. It has a return system that only exists in the UK. So we have already gone above and beyond. There is a proposal, which was in the planning application, but EDF are trying their best to not do it, to install speakers around that pipe to play sounds that deter fish. I don't know what those sounds are. Some people have suggested it's disco. I'm not so sure. I think it might be sort of like screeching hawk sounds or something like that. But it's rather mad. And EDF basically realised nuclear power is a very, 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 very safe technology. It's on a megawatt basis, it's the safest form of technology if you factor in things like mining, building wind turbines, air pollution from coal. It's extremely safe. But if you have to install speakers in a very murky patch of water going deep down, you need some commercial divers. And that's a very, very risky job. And so there would be a risk that they'd be the most dangerous nuclear power station in the world, not because of the radiation itself, which is actually extremely low, but because the environmental protections would end up killing commercial divers. Not a great system. I'll give you one more example. When it comes to building roads, railways and trams, Britain spends more money per mile than almost any other country in the world. Trams, for instance. We pay more than twice the European average to build a tram. Birmingham's East Side expansion, a recent tram project, is the most expensive tram project in the world on a per mile basis. In France, they build cheaper, and as a result, every French city with 150,000 or more people has been able to afford a tram system. In Britain, so that's about 21 French cities, I think, or maybe even 27. In Britain, it's just 7 cities have a tram system. A place as big as Leeds doesn't have a metro system at all. It's the largest city in the world without one. We tie these projects up in red tape, so surely swapping cars for a tram has to be one of the most obviously green things you can do. You're replacing tailpipe emissions, you're getting more people out of the car onto a extremely high capacity form of public transport. You're cutting, why do you need to do an environmental impact assessment? But yet the reality is that millions of pounds on all of these projects goes on, surveying for bats. I'm not really sure what the risk to bats are from lorries versus trams, but they have to do this work because we failed to reform this in the last 14 years. The governments, to their credit, started the process, but they didn't actually get to the end goal. Now, the good news is we can fix this. We know what's wrong with Britain. It's not that, if you're a country and you don't have a world-leading university, or you have really bad labour laws or complex industrial relations, it's quite tricky to solve those problems. Britain has a very simple solution. Stop banning investment by fixing the planning system. Look, I know it won't be easy, not because it's a complicated problem, but because, I sat at a round table of Conservative councillors yesterday. I know that politically this is very difficult. People don't always like new development in their patch. But if the Conservatives or if this Labour government are going to be credible on the economy, they have to face facts and they have to free Britain to build again. Thank you.
Fiona, over to you.
Thank you very much. So, will the government achieve the economic growth it purports to champion through the top-down thinking it's come up with? Well, quite simply, the answer is no. We all know how important growth is. It defines a person or a company's ability to get results. And a key sector that proves its ability to do this again and again is the independent retail sector. The total value of UK retail sales in 2023 was 462 billion. It creates 6% of the UK's GDP, employs 2.9 million people, and Britain's smaller stores, interestingly, lead the way when it comes to growth, recording an 8.1% rise in sales last year compared to 2.6% at large high street businesses. And independent shops are run by practical people who innovate. They've battled through a long, prolonged period of upheaval with changing consumer behaviour, but they still offer connections to community, to those that are struggling with anxiety and isolation. They help secure local economies, creating jobs and keeping money circulating. They value their customers and they value the employees that work with them. But the top-down interventionist agenda from the government is not conducive to this continuing. So, looking at what the Prime Minister said at Labour Party conference, he played to those in the room somewhat, might say. He said decisive government is going to determine what works. So that means those in Whitehall, not those who run the businesses day to day, who know the businesses, they work for them, their target market, and what actually works. Instead, he celebrated public ownership, a slew of new bodies that will follow government thinking, as opposed to looking at whether or not their actions actually help businesses. And this kind of policy stifles innovative thinking. It places burdens on businesses that want the freedom to do what they do best, to grow, to contribute to the economy, to create jobs. So what needs to happen? Well, firstly, businesses should not be stifled by taxes like business rates that mean they end up in debt before they've even begun. Retail already pays more than its fair share of this tax compared to other sectors, and the Prime Minister himself supposedly says if you work hard, you should have a fair chance to get on. Well, not with this government, it seems, So, business should not be stifled by regulation either. The government now has greater powers to query business information. Of course, businesses must be open about who they are and what they do and pay their taxes, but these new rules give them carte blanche to set off inquiries into small businesses, meaning the businesses can't focus on growing because they're just obeying government red tape. So thirdly, changes to employee rights. Now, of course, it's important that employees have rights, but as opposed to trusting businesses like retailers, they're imposing new roles that make them hard to grow. Small independent retails often employ family members. They create value for the next generation. They put people at the heart of their businesses. But now they're going to have a set number of rules regarding the rights of the employee again and again, giving them more barriers for growth. And they mean they have to increase the prices, which will hit everybody's pockets in order to maintain profitability. And if these businesses don't work, they won't have the jobs, they won't pay the taxes. So, having explained the problems, what does the government need to do? Well, they need to work alongside business, as they purport to want to do. They need to trust them to do the right thing. They need to help them grow for the benefit of everyone. They need to shift taxes to profitability. Stop using national insurance and business rates as painless ways of revenue. They aren't. They need to maintain support for retailers through business rates relief, whilst they're going to scrap retail business rates, hopefully, as scrapping or reducing this support will just damage small businesses. They need to ensure there's a baseline of compliance regarding staff rights, obviously, but as staff costs are already the highest bill a business has, it doesn't need more restrictive rules and regulations that cost more. They need to ensure planning rules encourage shops and businesses can adapt their business without having to go through arduous hoops in the name of compliance in case they decide that they want to expand their business or do something that they haven't always done. Because again, as I say, these businesses are always innovative. And they need to encourage local councils to eliminate restrictive parking measures. That does just add an extra barrier regarding encouraging footfall. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you to the IEA for organising this panel. My goal today is to speak a little bit about tech and innovation and how I think the government's approach to technology is full of the right kind of noise but not very good follow through. Before that, though, Sam's commentary on planning reminded me of an anecdote I couldn't resist, just because I know that originally this panel was pitched with my colleague Samuel Hughes, who does CPS housing. I am aware, having lived in a few different countries, that there are a few policies that can ruin residents' imaginations. And as my wife and I were looking to buy property, I texted the listing from Zoopla of a house we were going to put an offer in on to my former realtor who helped me sell property in Virginia. And I took the screenshot, and she responded being like, "Oh, very, very interesting, Matthew. Just one question. What's a chain?" And it occurs to me that when we're thinking about regulation, we should keep our minds open. There are many different cages we put ourselves in. But to return to technology, I want to start on an optimistic note that this country has a lot of great comparative advantages when it comes to technology. If you think about how Silicon Valley emerged, think of the advantages it enjoyed. It had access to excellent institutes of higher education, excellent talent in finance. It was in a country with relatively stable rule of law and governance. And the United Kingdom is very similar. We punch well above our weight when it comes to higher education. We are home to one of the most respected financial institutions in the world, where English speaking, the common law is respected all over the world. And yet I think if a lot of people were looking over the last couple decades of technology policy, they would be forgiven for being disappointed. And that's in part because I don't think we've seized on a lot of the advantages that we have. We have tons of potential on AI, life science, quantum. We lead the world in a lot of these sectors. But if an alien anthropologist came down and was examining the British government and asked what does it think about tech, I think the alien anthropologist would say the British government's role in tech is to bully American technology companies. And there's been an approach on specifically online speech and competition, this fear of big, that I think has stifled a lot of thinking in Westminster. So the two biggest examples are, I think, the Online Safety Act, which many of you will be familiar with. But the other, I think, is the CMA, which is enjoying new powers thanks to the Digital Competition Bill that passed just before the last general election. Keep in mind that, think about what the CMA has been doing in the last couple of years. It has blocked Meta from buying Jiffy, it blocked Microsoft from purchasing Activision, and it is now enjoying much more power thanks to legislative power handed to it. And I think that, unfortunately, is a tendency that I think we'll see more and more of. It's a real shame because you would think after Brexit, one of our comparative advantages is regulation. We are free of the we have a lot of opportunities. But I'm reminded of when I first came to CPS, one of my first tasks was to analyze retained EU law and to think about, well, what's now free of the EU, what's still on the books that we should get rid of in order to free a 21st century British economy. And I was sent a database by one of the special advisors, and I looked through it and had about 5,000 individual pieces of regulation and legislation. I thought it was quite interesting, and at the bottom I thought I need to analyze this, and I clicked on the download button and was asked whether I would like the data in a PowerPoint or a JPEG file. And I know it's a glib anecdote somewhat, but there is, I think, something to keep strongly in mind, which is not often the case that the government even knows the scale of its own regulation and how many businesses it is affecting, let alone know how to count them, and once we've identified what to do with them. Because if anything, the last couple of years have showcased that the government is not shy about regulating technology when the rhetoric is very good. We've had tons of good rhetoric on AI, on new and emerging technologies, but we should let history be some sort of guide as to what we should expect. And I think we should also think about our expectations for the technology sector. Back in May, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, said that he wanted the UK to be home to a $1 trillion market cap technology company within, I think it was 5 to 10 years. Which, to put it in perspective, Microsoft has a market cap larger than all of the FTSE 100 companies combined. It is a big ask to think that we could be anything like Silicon Valley, but there are room for some kind of optimism. Namely, although the Labour government is implementing many policies I disagree with, it is refreshing to have a government that is arguing in favour of economic growth. And I think when the next Conservative government gets into power, it needs to emphasize that the point of regulation is exactly that. Oftentimes, a lot of regulation, I think, gets passed without justification for it being questioned or interrogated nearly enough. This is, of course, the opportunity for me to plug some of my work at CPS, where I've written more about what I think an ideal regulatory regime for technology looks like. The first is to put economic growth as a priority of regulation. That should be the unapologetic and stated goal of economic regulation. And regulation should focus specifically on preventing likely and significant harm to life, limb, national security, and critical infrastructure. And crucially, it should be businesses in the position of asking for forgiveness rather than permission from the government. There is a role, I think, for government in regulation to say, look, here are specific harms that we aim to prevent. The CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority, would like flying machines not to collide with other flying machines, fly into buildings, drop out of the sky, go near airports without permission, these sort of things. It should not be in the position of drone companies, for example, to try and navigate over years and years the different maze of regulations. We need much more clarity on that. And with that, I'll conclude with an emphasis on regulation is where the comparative advantage, I think, can be in the future. We're not going to be home to the new Microsoft, I think, anytime soon. And we should be wary that around the world, people are looking to the EU and the US for regulatory templates. But there's no reason why they couldn't also look to the UK if we play our cards right.
Thank you. Yeah. Last, certainly not least, Victoria, and I think maybe Matthew's remarks lead quite nicely into what you were going to say.
Yes, definitely. A lot to pick up on there. And I'm sorry to say, Matthew, that with the Digital Markets, Consumers and Competition Bill, I'm afraid the view of ministers and officials was that was an example of us using the benefits of Brexit in a good way. And unfortunately, we've ended up, if such a thing were possible, probably doing something worse than the EU's equivalent Digital Markets Act. More generally, though, I am going to talk a bit about the regulatory state and its rather detrimental effect on economic growth. The recent Smarter Regulation White Paper that the Department of Business and Trade published back in May, not long before the general election, included the following figure. The impact of red tape costs could be as high as 3 to 4% of GDP. And 45% of all businesses see regulation as a burden on their success, or wasn't particularly prioritised by the regulators. So the last government, actually driven by the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, extended the growth duty to cover the economic regulators, by which I mean Ofwat, Ofgem, Ofcom. Is it just those three? I think it's just those three. And also to enhance the guidance across the piece for all the regulators, including adding reporting requirements so that they would actually have to show that they were duly taking the economic growth duty into account and account for how they were achieving that. So that's all reasonably positive within the constraints, the political constraints that we were operating at the time. However, the guidance included, it had a list of drivers of growth to try and help regulators identify the kinds of things they should be attending to when they were thinking about economic growth. And one of them was environmental sustainability. Now, on one level, of course, that's unobjectionable, because of course we need a habitable and stable environment and natural ecosystems, both for quality of life, but also for economic stability. But of course, what this driver, this environmental sustainability driver, actually meant is that all the regulators were just reminded of the legal frameworks for net zero and the environmental targets from the Climate Change Act and the Environment Act. And of course, this is also claimed to be economically necessary as well. So the document said a credible policy path for a net zero transition is vital to reduce uncertainty and enable economic agents to react smoothly and appropriately. Demand for environmental sustainability also has a key role in driving economic growth for green technologies. Now, that's a bit of a word salad, but the upshot is, in practice, that this drives the coach and horses through the whole of the rest of the document and the growth duty itself, because it makes very clear to all the regulators that their prioritisation of economic growth comes second after their legal duties to meet our carbon budgets and the other Environment Act duties, which I think included, hilariously, a legally binding duty to reverse the decline of nature by 2030. So looking forward to that. But it's also, as well, you might have noticed there as well, the pursuit of these quite, in my view, economically illiterate concepts of green growth and green jobs. And they consider that by imposing these duties, it will somehow stimulate growth. And, well, I think we can see how that's been going so far. And it obviously gets worse as the court's interpretation of these legal duties gets ever more expansive. And in fact, the current government has no interest in challenging these decisions. And in fact, they probably lose anyway, so they may well be right not to throw good money after bad on that. But worse, they have no intention of changing the law to obviate the effect of these expansive interpretations. And as a result, we've seen a number of infrastructure projects being blocked. And that obviously has a very serious deterrent effect, and all the things that Sam was talking about right at the beginning. I'm also just going to talk briefly as well about the Retained EU Law programme, which I think a lot of people on our side of the debate were rather disappointed that the sunset in the Retained EU Law bill was taken out, and instead of letting all EU laws be automatically revoked at the end of last year, the default was reversed, so all were preserved unless they were actively revoked, either by a list or subsequently by way of statutory instruments. Now, the idea of a sunset and an automatic guillotine of all EU laws was tremendous. I would have been very excited by that. Unfortunately, Whitehall had no intention of letting that happen. And there was a huge programme of statutory instruments underway to actively preserve almost everything. So we would have ended up in a far worse position of having yet another layer of regulations on top of the existing regulations just to preserve them all. It was going to be chaos, because there was also the risk that some might slip through the cracks and nobody would really know whether they were preserved or not. And unfortunately, ministers had no intention of supporting an organised process of revocation so that there would be that clarity of what had been revoked. So when I joined Kemi Badenoch's team in the Department of Business and Trade, dealing with this was our first and most pressing concern. Now, we also had the difficulty that the previous minister in the role who'd introduced the Retained EU Law Bill into Parliament had to commit to Parliament that there would be no reduction in environmental protections or workers' rights. So a combination of this sort of stasis across Whitehall, the lack of ministerial enthusiasm for actually deregulating or revoking anything, and the previous political commitments made by Jacob Rees-Mogg meant there was very little room for manoeuvre. Now, in the end, thanks to my former boss, Kemi Badenoch's persistent leadership, we did manage to repeal, reform and revoke around 2,000 retained EU law items. And there was an ongoing programme chipping away at law. But it was just very difficult because in substance, there was not the political will from the departments to actually do it. And in fact, it gets worse. We were actively passing even more new laws, or in the process of passing even more new laws, that not only didn't meet the standards of our smarter regulation programme, they were in direct contravention of the government's own regulatory principles that had been put in place just a few months before in, I think it was called the Opportunities of Brexit white paper. And I'm thinking a couple of particularly egregious examples: the football governance bill, which was the bill to regulate football, which obviously Labour are enthusiastically continuing with now, and the new regulation concerned with anti-terrorism training by events venues and hospitality venues, enthusiastically promoted by Tom Tugendhat. I'll just drop that into the conversation, which was known as Martin's Law in memory of one of the victims of the Manchester Arena bombing. And this law was going to cost billions of pounds. It'll come as no surprise, I'm sure, to anyone in this room that kind of regulation is extremely onerous on anyone who has to implement it. Hire staff, put compliance programs into place, and so on. And I'm going to close on this because I think this is a good example of the limitations of a procedural approach to regulatory reform. So the Martin's Law had a very comprehensive regulatory impact assessment, and that included a very detailed cost-benefit analysis. It came out as positive. It was going to be economically beneficial, even though it did very clearly account for all the massive costs that the businesses concerned would have to absorb. But the very creative officials who had produced it had formulated a nominal monetized economic value to people's feelings of being less worried about terrorism. And that was such a huge number that it outweighed the costs and it flew through its cost-benefit analysis. And I think that's just a really good illustration of how these procedural controls and checks and balances, they're important. I'd much rather have an impact assessment than not have an impact assessment, but it's not enough. We need the substantive political commitment and understanding, because I highly doubt whether any ministers actually read that impact assessment in any depth whatsoever, or any of the many more in similar vein. So and yes, I'm afraid the Labour government are using all of those powers of the regulatory state in pursuit of their admittedly at present somewhat patchy industrial policy, and all that's going to do is further empower and entrench this the bureaucratic class of compliance professionals, lawyers, although that's obviously good work for me, consultants, and so on. And unless we can reverse out of that somehow, I don't see any really good prospect for growth, or certainly not for abundance for some time to come.
Victoria, thank you. Brilliant. Pressing there. Really true. I'll have audience questions in a minute. I just wanted to pose an initial one of my own. Now, we talk a lot about practicalities of policy, of the economics of a growth agenda, regulatory reform, and so on. I wonder to what extent culture plays a big role in this question as well. I'm struck by the fact that people have kind of fallen out with of love with the idea of growth and abundance and development. And there's a guy in America at one of the think tanks, the American Enterprise Institute, called James. I'm going to murder this surname. I think it's good. There we go. Who writes a Substack called Faster, Please, and he talks about his goal of developing, calls him upwing conservatism, which is basically the idea of conservatism, which is all about a bigger, brighter, more exciting future, not just this sort of sense of managed decline and restrictions and making do. I think one just example of this, if you like, cultural deficiency, and it's not just British, I think it's more widespread than that, is that it's almost impossible to find any kind of optimistic sci-fi anymore. When was the last time you saw a... Well, Star Trek is the one, isn't it? And there are actually some quite good...
Star Trek isn't optimistic anymore. If you actually look at the most recent series, it's about the total collapse of everything.
So we could, yes, now we might go down a tangent here. Discovery, very depressing. Star Trek, Strange New Worlds has that kind of old optimism to it as well. But those are, in some senses, a throwback. Everything I think we see is about the the kind of dystopia that we're heading towards and the ills of technology and everything like that. I just asked the panel briefly to reflect on this. I mean, do we need to see a cultural shift as well as a policy shift?
Yes, Sam.
Yeah.
I
would just say yes. Well, I'm actually reminded of a phrase I'm probably going to steal from my wife, who recently referred to something she called the British complacency complex, which I think is a worry. There is. We mustn't forget the area in time we're in. We still haven't fully recovered from the 07-08 financial crash, and our productivity is terrible, and we have to consider the political effects of a generation of young people having grown up without ever having experienced economic growth. They just really don't know what it is like to live through a society that is changing technologically, changing culturally to an extent prompted by economic growth. And I think the long-term effects of that are that they're sort of muted to calls for it. When you say to someone under the age of 25, we need economic growth, a lot of them, I think, understandably are like, well, why? I've never seen what that does. I read it in books, but I haven't lived through it. And I do worry that there is a culture on this side of the Atlantic, for sure, of it'll be fine, or if it's not fine, that's not so bad. And I think things could get bad. And just because we were the home of Newton, Darwin, Shakespeare, and we beat the Nazis doesn't mean that we'll be fine in the long run necessarily. There are a lot of Spain used to run much more of the shop than it currently does. There's no reason Britain couldn't go that same way. So no, I do think there's a cultural problem. What I don't know is what the antidote to that is. Cultures are complex. They change for a variety of different reasons, and they're very difficult to design and shift one way or the other. So I've diagnosed a problem, but I don't know what to do about it.
Does anyone else want to come in on this question?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I don't know if it's changed now, but at least when I was at school, there was pretty relentlessly anti-growth rhetoric. I remember at my sixth form, there was a display, and I'm not sure who they were quoting. It may even been David Attenborough, who knows a lot about a lot of things, but not a lot about everything. And it said something like, there are only two people who believe in infinite economic growth, madman and an economist. Big display in the library, anti-growth. I was studying economics at the time and thought it was very stupid, basically. But a lot of people clearly would have been sort of bombarded with this kind of pessimism about the future and about guilt about economic growth. And I think that's one cultural problem. But another cultural problem is what I would call safetyism, a sort of anti-risk-taking. I mean, Victoria talks about the bonkers idea of Martin's Law, and I've every now and then I'll tweet something angry about it, and I'll get quite a lot of positive reactions from people who understand that actually it's maybe not a good idea to force everyone who works in a church hall to do a pointless training course, because we've all done pointless training courses in our work, and we all know how pointless they are, and nothing comes in. When every civil servant does a course saying don't work in public on your laptop. Yet how many civil servants can you sit next to on the train who are clearly dealing with confidential government documents right in front of your very face? These things go in one ear and out the other, and they're all pointless. But one of the things someone replied, well, if it saves one life, it will be worth it. But obviously there are trade-offs, and we have to engage with trade-offs. Sometimes doing something means you can't do another thing, and cost-benefit analysis is useful here. But part of the problem was in a lot of regulation, particularly around fire safety in the wake of Grenfell, we decided that actually we were going to ignore cost-benefit analysis for a bit because we just wanted to go a bit harder on safety. And one of the stupidest bits of regulation the last government has proposed, and I think is sort of working its way in, it's not quite implemented yet, but it's this idea that every building that is taller than 18 metres must have 2 staircases. You cannot have 1 staircase anymore, because what would happen in a fire, so on and so forth. We've been coping relatively well with not doing this in sort of 6-storey mansion blocks all over the years. And they did an impact assessment on this. And how this might be a fun game, right? So what do you think, how many, So what do you think the cost-benefit ratio was? So how many costs to benefits do you think there were?
Retrofitting them or just on new builds?
Just on new builds. Just on new builds.
Oh, there's going to be a couple of billion each.
But what do you think, how many... So let's say you've got the benefits here, you've got the costs here, and I'm going to spoil it that the costs are bigger than the benefits. How much bigger do you think the costs are? Lives saved, people feeling safety insurance.
1,000 times.
Okay, 294 times. And that was a regulation passed by the last government and working its way through, already leading to developments pausing, being stopped. We have to challenge this safetyism. We have to be frank with people that there are trade-offs. If you want much safer buildings, you might end up increasing the cost of building those buildings. You might mean that those buildings can no longer be as tall on the same amount of land. And if we don't engage with that, we don't challenge this sort of excessive safetyism, we're going to be a poorer country.
Yeah. I think one of the fundamental things is, unfortunately, a lot of people don't have much pride anymore. They don't want to really strive. They feel that they can just be okay, that everything should be fine, that things should be given to them, and that they should not necessarily have to develop their own way of growing and being part of society, quite simply. Because, again, coming back to the retailers, all of them have put their own money in. When I started Keystone, I put my own money in. I wanted to build something and help people and do things, and a lot of people, and if you kind of come at that as a fundamental backdrop, then you're not going to win the big economic arguments, because they're just going to say, well, it's someone else's problem.
I mean, there's something people talk about. We've got a culture that maybe lacks agency and initiative, and that it's more than just a regulatory problem, that people are risk averse and following processes, the rules, and sort of hiding from taking responsibility. But again, it's a sort of deep-seated thing. Victoria, do you want to say anything before we take a few audience questions?
I'll just say, for the full story of the fights that we in the Department of Business and Trade had with the special advisors and ministers in DLUC about the 2 staircases rule, you'll have to buy my memoirs in due course when they come out.
Are you working on them?
Perhaps I should. It'll be very wonkish memoirs.
All right. Lots of questions. Let's start at the front and we'll work our way back. Yes, I'm Diddler here.
Hi, Adam Kent. I'm a Cabinet Member for Economy and Skills at Worcestershire County Council. I also run a tech business that exports software to America, controlling sports bars and everything. And I came here to be inspired, but I've sat here more and more frustrated, and I now feel semi-suicidal in terms of what I've heard, because we actually presided and created this. 9 years ago, Sajid was my MP, he said we were going to have a bonfire of red tape, we're going to eliminate £10 billion of it, and all we've done in the next 9 years is make it worse. And we're responsible. We've got wealth creators being driven out of the country. I'm sitting here thinking, what's my inspiration here? You talk about sci-fi. Interstellar is probably the answer. We need to get off this planet completely. But getting to the point, really, you talked about infrastructure and trams. I was in Las Vegas recently and watched Elon Musk build 2 miles of tunnels in a year for £47 million with 3 stations that's operational, with cars driving underground through Las Vegas with a minimum of regulation, because they just wanted to get it done. And if we don't have that attitude in this country, and we don't stop making laws thinking we need to rule everybody's lives and don't let the businesses get on with it, then we won't have any of us left here. So the question to the panel is, instead of what we've done wrong and going over it, what do we need to do to fix it?
Very good. We'll take a few questions.
Okay, Dominic, Connor, full disclosure, it was my work on the guild market that helped bring down Liz Truss. But apart from that, sorry about that. But this is our fault, isn't it? We've been in power for 14 years. This big report, I did a quick sum after you said that, and that was 2,000 well-paid jobs for a year to produce that report. On the subject of AI, which is my home subject, because I'm Vice Chair of the Conservative Technology Forum, when the Labour Party turned up at APPG meetings on AI, They literally, their first sentence, we need to regulate this, before anything had been explained to them at all. And we created the Alan Turing Institute, a formless hell of people whose 50% of their work, and they're quite proud of this, is worrying about AI. That's what they do. They were supposed to develop new AIs. What they do is worry about the AIs that were produced 3 years ago. What are we going to do better next time? Because we did really badly this time. I know you deleted a few regulations, but we created this. We can't blame Labour. We will blame Labour in 5 years, but we created it. How can we stop a future Labour Conservative government? I'm optimistic. The reason I'm optimistic about this Labour government, and it's not a good thing to say amongst Conservatives, I struggle to see how they could be worse in terms of regulation. I think we've actually reached some physical limit on the amount of regulation it is actually possible to do.
I feel we may test that proposition. Let's continue along the front. We'll hear from the panel. Actually, we'll take the gentleman behind you afterwards as well.
Okay. Yeah. My name is David Metcalf. I'm just basically a party member. That's the best way of putting it. My attitude has been for a long time, when did we decide to do away with volenti non fit injuria? Which, if anybody in the room doesn't understand, means you consented to the injury. When I was a little boy, I regularly fell out of trees. I ripped my trousers a number of times, and I got thumped for it for obvious reasons, because in those days this was just after the war, and it wasn't easy to come by. But now we have regulations that say, the water mustn't be too hot, etc., etc. That apparently came from a lady in America who bought some coffee, stuck it between her thighs and drove, and consequently scalded herself. So we ended up with everybody having to make sure that there are signs left, right and centre saying, warning, this water is hot, and we have to allow for it. Similarly, somebody walked into the back of one of these big Winnebagos to make himself a cup of coffee and slammed into something because he'd been watching too much Star Trek, and he thought that when you switched on that special lever, the thing drove itself. So, why don't we go back to volenti non-fit injuria and start getting the courts asking, hang on a minute, why did you do that in the first place?
Oh, thank you very much. Yes. Okay, Simon, I think there are... I'm struck, by the way, obviously we've all seen the bags of nuts that say, warning may contain nuts. But I think the strangest one I ever encountered was a box of golf balls that said, warning, do not microwave. It's a little moment, but there you go.
Oh, they would explode.
So I think that in a way I can bring those things together. There are a couple of questions I posed on the panel on the basis of those remarks. The first one, to try and inject a dose of practicality and optimism into this, is if each of you could suggest the one thing that you would do that would be important to get right next time around, to try and break out of this slump. That would be great. And I think we've had various mentions of other international examples as well. Again, for each of you, if you want to venture onto this territory, what country do you look to that can offer, in some respect, a good example for the UK?
I'll try and answer both questions at once by saying New Zealand. And I'll mention that not just because my father's a New Zealander, but because it provides a useful example of something you see elsewhere in the world, and the post-Soviet world is another example where you can get very good economic regulatory reform if there's a crisis and the government really has no other option, which is rather depressing. New Zealand, under the conservative governments of the 1980s, was the most controlled economy outside the communist world. And the Labour government came in and had no choice but to engage in what they called Rogernomics. And now New Zealand is one of the freest economies in the world. If you look at a lot of the history of radical, swift, free market regulatory reforms around the world, you'll see that they come on the back of crises. The unfortunate reality is that regulators, lawmakers, bureaucrats, and the rest of the Westminster bubble just don't have the incentive structure aligned to do what I think a lot of us would like them to do, which is to take a blowtorch to a lot of regulations to really reassess what the point of government is and to get the economy growing. And I don't want to finish by saying the best we can hope for is a crisis, because people really do get hurt. People, unemployment leads to loss of life. And as my father will tell you, in New Zealand, those reforms resulted in a lot of farmers committing suicides. There were riots, social unrest. It was unpleasant. But it's not that it can't be done. It's how can we do these kind of reforms absent a crisis that forces the hand? And I don't know the answer to that, actually. I think on the margins, you can pick on particular industries and particular sectors where you can learn from international comparators, but that's not going to necessarily result in the kind of growth that we'd all like.
Victoria?
Do I need the microphone or a good one? Thank you. So in terms of the practical steps as to how to reverse this sort of decline, I think I would say we need, or let's say the next Conservative government, assuming a Labour government is not going to indulge in Rogernomics, the next Conservative government needs to avoid the trap of the previous sort of 2010 onwards Conservative governments of just broadly leaving everything that Labour did in place and not reversing out of those sort of Blairite constitutional settlements and structural bits of legislation, such as the Climate Change Act, the Equality Act and the Human Rights Act. I think there I would be looking for a sort of equivalent to in fiscal policy you talk about programme level cuts, because efficiency savings here and salami slicing here never really moves the dial in terms of public spending, and I think the equivalent in the regulatory system is process improvements and transparency and making regulators a bit better and more responsive is fine, but it's not going to make those structural changes that we need. We need programme level repeals. In addition now to the 3 new Labour era statutes that I mentioned, I would add a number of the last Conservative government's structural bits of legislation, the Digital Markets, Consumers and Competition, and the Online Safety Act being 2 prime examples that really entrench that culture of suspicion of technology and safetyism. And I think that's the sort of really substantive turnaround, renewal, one might even say, of Conservative government that we would need to make that those improvements.
Well done, slipping renewal in there as well. Fiona, that's out.
Quite simply, we should reform the civil service.
I love you, government.
If you're a civil servant and you are there after a long period of time, even if you're quite useless, you just move departments, and that's just no way to run a business. Yeah, and then on the second point, Finland for nuclear. So when I've been involved now in politics for 27 years, because I did NUS Wales with Vaughan Gething, so I saw the rise and fall of him as rather funny. And my boss at the time, when I worked in Parliament, was Shadow Energy Minister, and we actually went out to Finland to see their nuclear site, and it was just spectacular. And what staggers me about all of this is that was when it was not seen as a very sexy job, so it was given to a really good man, but wasn't seen as, one of the top guys at the time. And that was 2002. And here we are, 2024. We haven't moved on. And it's a bit pathetic, actually.
So I think one of the problems when you talk to politicians, particularly on the Conservative side, is that they will usually say something like, I want to get rid of red tape. But the problem is politicians don't have a lot of bandwidth. And so they say, I want red tape. Then they go to the civil servants. Can you find some examples of red tape to cut? What you really need, and, opposition is an opportunity here, long talks with individual businesses, not saying, look, I don't care about how many jobs you create or your positive GVA stats, like, yeah, good, I'm not against the idea of your business. Don't show me any more cranes. Tell me all the ways the Environment Agency, Natural England, the Planning Inspectorate is ruining your life. I want horror stories. You can be honest with me. I am not going to use this then to later down the line hamstring you. And I think that needs to be the approach. There needs to be deep dives, very, very serious work. We're doing some on a range of areas. Nuclear is one, trams is another. So one thing we learn, so when it comes to digging up trams, Britain moves way more utilities underneath trams than any other European country. And one of the reasons is when we were sort of setting up the regulations for who pays for what, we came to the conclusion that 92% of the cost should be covered by the tram company, and the rest should be covered by the utility company. Other European countries took it differently. And when you have this situation, and the fact that moving a utility typically means putting some new pipes in, putting some new wires in, upgrading some things, utility companies started saying, well, yeah, I would like some brand new pipes that don't leak. That'd be brilliant. Could I also have this and this and this? And all of a sudden we added lots of costs. But you only find that out if you talk to someone who has been involved in building a tram. And that's kind of what we need the party to do over the next 5 years, having those deep conversations, coming up with those very, very specific things. Now, if you are talk about one thing that we should definitely do, it has to come back to housing. You know, people can earn a lot more money living in London, but they are actually poorer as a result because housing costs eat into all of that productivity gain. So they don't take the most productive, best jobs available to them. We need to make it easier to live in London. The Conservatives were right in their manifesto to say that London should be the target for almost all the new homes. The problem with Labour is they want to build more houses, but they don't understand that a house in Burnley isn't as valuable for economic growth as a house in London. We need to be the party of getting homes built in London. And I think, you know, to the example of New Zealand, one thing they did was they said, look, if you're within walking distance of a train station in our biggest city, you should probably be able to build up to at least 5 or 6 stories. We should be doing something similar, densifying our cities and ensuring that the housing crisis isn't shunted around the country so that you don't have this absurd situation where Winchester pays the price for London's housing crisis because people commute there when they'd rather live in London. And then people who work in Winchester have to commute from Eastleigh. It's a absolutely mad system. And then the solution we come to is that we need to build more houses in Eastleigh and not London.
Very good. Now we'll take another round of questions at the back this time. I'd ask if we can keep them short. So I've seen 4 hands, very short questions, because we are low on to start there. Yes. Martin, you and I were a party member as an engineer. I'm going to try and make it a question, so I hope it doesn't sound like an observation. In the 1830s, Brunel built the railway from London to Bristol in 6 years. That was men with shovels, horses and carts, no boring machines, no trap-laying machines. I give you that on the left-hand side, and I give you HS2 over here. Will it ever be finished? And I suggest that we've got a national ambition to get things done, and maybe a rejuvenated Conservative Party would be the people to do that. Would you have your thoughts? Thank you. Same question. Alison next. I think Sam and I have a mutual friend who has a bet that the flying car will make it to Manchester before HS2 ever does. So there we are. I'd be happy with Birmingham or even Birmingham. Yes, Alison.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about regulation by stealth. So particularly for businesses that are trying to do business with any quasi-governmental body or government or large business that is already regulated, they are often asked to comply with the regulations that they want business from. So what can we do about regulation by stealth?
Very good, thank you. Gentleman right at the back, and then we'll finish in this corner over here by the cameras.
Ian Lloyd. I lived in France for 30, 40 years. I created an institution ex nihilo without asking anybody, and brought everybody together around commercial property finance. We became the interlocutors of the French Treasury and French Central Bank. I had a client, Sam, who produced the Nottingham tram. Mm-hmm. He's French. I know the guys who built it. So you and I should be talking to them, and we're going to unpack what they did. Last comment is, I joined the Conservatives in 1978. I was secretary of the British Conservative Association in France, but came back and helped in Winchester, which is my city, 1979, an awful man called John Brown. But the word is not growth, it's progress. Surely, if we use the term progress, then we get around the awful thing which happened during the Brexit debate. Your GDP, it's not my GDP, they don't feel it. When you talk to people about progress, and don't forget how depressing don't forget, none of you were born, but 1970s were deeply depressing, even more depressing than today. I left Morgan Grenfell to go to Germany, and the unemployment benefit I got was more than my salary at Morgan Grenfell. I was aged 24 or 25. So this is the message, it's progress. Keith Joseph, CPS, all the rest of it. Does that make sense?
Thank you very much, yes. Excellent. And the last question over here in the corner, please.
Hi, I'm Paul Martin. I'm Finance Director at Centrepoint. I was previously in the health sector and the rail sector, who are both competing to be the most over-regulated sectors around. I suppose my question is around risk appetite. It's come up here. There seems to be a completely different risk appetite in the private sector than the public sector, but I would say the public sector and the civil service. And I suppose my question probably to yourself, Victoria, is how on earth are we going to manage the blob that is the civil service and change their risk appetite so they actually deregulate and don't keep layering on one regulation after another?
Well, Victoria, why don't we start there with you? Feel free to go for any of those questions, and this will sort of double as final remarks for the panel as to running short.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating because I think there are some areas where the risk appetite of civil servants, and I'm afraid to say oftentimes ministers as well, is very low. So when it comes to, for example, a consumer's risk of reading a fake review or having an additional charge dropped on them when they're booking an airline ticket, then the risk appetite is very low. That must be cracked down upon, and people must be helped not to accidentally pay more for something than they'd intended, or read something untrue on the internet. Very, very low risk appetite. But then when it comes to regulating, anything to do with infrastructure or planning, that if you think that the risk of getting it wrong is extremely high and the costs from getting it wrong are terrible, because that's what we're experiencing right now, their risk appetite is actually really high. Their risk appetite of passing laws and regulations, the two-staircase rule is actually a good example where it's a misplaced understanding of risk. They're focused solely on the risk of someone being caught in another terrible fire, but the risk of thousands and thousands and thousands of people not being able to find a nice, comfortable home to live for them and their families, it doesn't feature. So it's not just a level of risk, it's about recognising where the risks are and what the competing different risks of the respective available decisions are. And I don't really know how we fix that. And I'm slightly reluctant to blame the civil service for everything. Because I think in most cases, civil servants do execute what the politicians tell them. And often the answer will be, oh, well, it's the law, we have to do this. And then ministers, unfortunately, will often say, oh, well, yeah, we'll just have to do it then, instead of saying, well, we should change the law. I'm afraid that's the sort of rut that we find ourselves in. I'll just very quickly, on Alison's point about regulation by stealth, I would also add to that regulation by threat as well, where the government or regulators will say, if you don't start behaving in XYZ way, we will regulate it, so you have to. And I think that's people often worry about the rule of law, but they never seem to worry about the rule of law in those kinds of contexts. Another example would be the FCA and the PRA's new diversity quotas, where all regulated firms will have to try to hire certain numbers of people of different races, and I believe they're also male and female quotas as well. And they put that through under the Public Sector Equality Duty, under the Equality Act, which is completely wrong. It's I would say ultra vires, But because regulated firms are so terrified of getting on the wrong side of the FCA, nobody challenged it. Because if you're on the wrong side of the FCA, they can make your life as a business very, very difficult indeed. And so everyone just gets on with it. And that sort of combination is very, very dangerous.
Matthew, you like progress, don't you?
I do. I was going to focus on that semantic point in the latter half of my comments. But I'll begin by talking about the civil service, because I have this very funny story of something that happened to me last year, I think it was, when someone came to me from the medical marijuana industry saying, we're in a bit of a bind because the Conservative government legalized medical marijuana, but the Home Office won't give me a license for it. Because the Home Office, and there's an office with 4 people working in it, I think, and their job is to issue these licenses, and they're refusing to do it because these people have interpreted the law to mean that medical marijuana was fine to legalize, but it didn't legalize in industry. Mm-hmm. And I naively said, oh, well, you should speak to the Home Office Minister, the Home Secretary. Or they said, no, we've done that. And then, well, you should speak to your local MP. And they said, no, we've done that. We've introduced private member bill letters and whatnot. And they were going around Tory party conferences just begging people to somehow find someone who could walk down the corridor of the Home Office, knock on this office and say, look, there's tens of millions of pounds of investment in building the warehouses, shipping, all the rest of it, and it's being stalled. And that was one of my first pieces of my first lessons in this country on just unnamed, unelected people being able to ruin the lives of dozens of people who are investing very heavily in an industry that they were assured would be legal. On improving the civil service, something apart from that kind of structural permissions issue, this is an idea that's not original to me, but maybe we should get rid of their silly pension and make it contingent on link that pension or pay to economic growth figures. I don't know, there might be an incentive structure that your pay or your pension or whatever it is determined by GDP growth of the previous year, something like that. On progress, I think there is rhetorically something all of us in the free market world need to do, which is to emphasize that for a lot of what people want when they're talking about progress, you need economic growth. If you are worried about climate change, if you're worried about the next plague or pandemic, if you're worried about the state of conflict around the world, you should be begging for more economic growth. And that is something I think we all need to think about, because I have found, at least anecdotally, that speaking to people about economic growth is a little dry. But once you frame it as a pro-progress, pro-human, pro-innovation lens, you get somewhere a little further. So those are my concluding thoughts on it.
I mean, I suppose the left completely stole liberalism from us, so perhaps we could steal progressivism back from them. Fiona, if you'd like to pick up any of those points.
Yeah, I'd like to focus on the regulation by stealth. So obviously with respect to regulation, you have primary legislation, you have secondary legislation. Now, I remember many, many years ago going through some statutory instruments, which is basically the main legislative thinking, and thinking, how on earth is that just being wafted through? And the problem that you have is that the way that the system works at the moment is these things just get wafted through. So it's quite simply that we need to make sure that there is better ways of looking at these statutory instruments, making sure that if there is one, tell your MP about it, get them to stand up, get them to actually go, you know what, don't want that. That's not good for my community. That's not good for my local business. Because at the moment we have such a huge majority of the Labour Party that that it's going to take a fight from all of us.
Thank you very much. And Sam, last word to you.
So a thought, Matthew, on how we can get this medical marijuana licence approved for these businesses. I think, one genuine idea is, could you persuade Jeremy Clarkson to make season 3 of Clarkson's Farm a new cash crop? Because he does actually, by showing people, and it's probably the best bit of free market television, to show people how mad the planning system is and all the barriers we impose on businesses that we, in theory, think are something that's essential to the country's security. So that would be my suggestion there on progress. So I don't know if you're aware of this idea of progress studies. So my friends run a magazine called Works in Progress. It's kind of inspired by an essay by Tyler Cowen, a libertarian thinker, and Yes, the Collisons, the two richest Irishmen in the world, and he's a very, very, very bright entrepreneur, and he basically looked into science and found that the groundbreaking discoveries weren't actually coming in the same way, and he came up with some very clever methodology to show that science appeared to be slowing down and was becoming less efficient. And he said that we need a study of how we reverse that and how we make people interested in scientific and technological progress. And I think progress studies as a movement has a really exciting thing about it, and I'm definitely keen on emphasising that. But what I would say is the classic, it's not my GDP. Margaret Thatcher would distinguish two types of policies. Policies that are popular and policies that have popular outcomes. Talking about growth might not be a popular policy, your individual deregulation. However, at the end of 5 years' time, people forget about the winter fuel allowance cuts and all of the clothing and what's not, and they'll be thinking, am I richer than I was 5 years ago? Is the economy working? Are the public services funded to an extent because we've grown the economy that I can get an appointment tomorrow rather than wait 3 weeks? If that's the case, you get re-elected. So I think, there becomes a sort of point where you go too far away from we can't focus on GDP growth, when actually, when it comes down to it, the economy is what decides elections, and you have to... Exactly.
There we are. Well, look, thank you all for joining us at various IEA events and conference, and thank you to my panel for their brilliant contributions today. If you want to learn more about the IEA, sign up for our newsletter and other fun stuff at insider.iea.org.uk. Panelists, thank you very much.